Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our fourth and final read in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is entitled Male-Female Facts and Fallacies, and the read that we're going to, this section of that chapter that we're going to read today is Summary and Implications. As I've mentioned before in this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you guys can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout this series, I will be doing an analysis and review at the end of this read of the read, and I will put a timestamp in this video's description so you guys can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about this. Be a short read today, so hopefully it'll be a short review as well. So without further ado, let's dive on into our read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our fourth read in Chapter 3 entitled Male-Female Facts and Fallacies, with this section entitled Summary and Implications. Among the many factors which influence male-female economic differences, the most elusive is employer discrimination. Since no one is likely to admit to discriminating against women, which is both illegal and socially stigmatized, in principle, discrimination can only be inferred indirectly from the disparities between women and men that remain after all the other factors have been taken into account. In practice, however, there is no way to take all other factors into account, since no one knows what they all are, and statistics are not always available for all the factors we do know about. What we are left with, after taking into account all the factors that we are aware of, and for which statistics are available, are residual differences which measure the upper limit of the combined effect of employer discrimination plus whatever other factors have been overlooked or not specified precisely. That residual is often much smaller than the gross income differences between women and men, sometimes a zero, and in a few instances, women earn more than men whose measured characteristics are similar. The empirical fact that most male-female economic differences are accounted for by factors other than employer discrimination does not mean that there have been no instances of discrimination, including egregious instances. But anecdotes about those egregious instances cannot explain the general pattern of male-female economic differences and their changes over time. Those changes are continuing. While in the period from 2000 to 2005, most women were still holding jobs making less than the weekly median wages, women were also 1.7 million out of 1.9 million new workers earning above the median wages. While hard data are preferable to anecdotes, even hard data have their limitations. Statistics may not be available on all the factors that determine hiring, pay, or promotions, nor can the direction of causation always be determined when the data are available. For example, the effect of marriage on women's economic opportunities and rewards may be estimated by comparing women who seem to be comparable in things that can be measured. But what if women who are more driven to pursue a career are less likely to marry early or perhaps at all? That is not measurable, which is not to say that it is not important. Income differences between less driven and more driven women may be falsely attributed to marriage, when in these cases differences in marriage patterns may be an effect rather than a cause. In other words, it need not be marriage, as such, which accounts for income differences between married and unmarried women. It can sometimes be difficult to distinguish income differences between the sexes caused by external barriers confronting women and differences caused by choices made by the women themselves. In addition to choices of educational specialties, occupations, and continuous or discontinuous employment, many married women have chosen to allow their husband's best job opportunities to determine where the couple will live, with the wife then taking whatever her best option might be at that location, even if there would be better options for her somewhere else. Such wives' reduced occupational opportunities in such cases are in effect an investment in their husband's enhanced occupational opportunities. This is a special handicap for women in the academic world, where the wife of a man who teaches at Cornell University, for example, will not have a comparable academic institution in which she can pursue her own career within 100 miles. It would be quite a coincidence if there was an opening in her field at Cornell at the same time when there was an opening there for her husband in his field. In some places, anti-nepotism policies would preclude her being hired even if there were such an opening. While some professors have sufficient clout to make the hiring of a spouse a precondition for accepting an academic appointment at a given institution, such a precondition can reduce the number and quality of the institutions that will make an appointment to either husband or wife. A more general indicator of wives' investments in their husband's earnings capacity is the changing ratio of husbands' earnings to their wives' earnings over time. As far back as 1981, 1/3 of all wives in the 25 to 34-year-old brackets had higher earnings than their husbands, but that percentage declined successively in older age brackets so that less than 10% of wives who were age 65 or older and had higher earnings than their husbands. In other words, the passage of time increased husbands' earnings more than the wives' earnings, another indication suggesting wives' investments in their husband's earning capacity. Given the numerous factors that impact the incomes and employment of women differently from the way they impact the incomes and employment of men, it can hardly be surprising that there have been substantial income differences between the sexes. Nor can all these differences be assumed to be negative on net balance for women, that is, taking other factors into account besides income. For example, the wives of affluent and wealthy men tend to work less and therefore earn less. But the wife of a rich man is not poor, no matter how low her income might be. In homes where the income of the husband exceeds the income of the wife, the actual spending of that income cannot be determined by whose name is on what paycheck, and research indicates that the wife usually makes more of those decisions about how the pooled family income is spent than the husband does. Such ultimate realities are beyond the reach of most statistics, but whatever arrangements wives and husbands agree to between themselves are certainly no less important than what third-party observers might prefer to see. While fallacious inferences can be based on gross income data, the fallacy is not in the undisputed fact of male-female income differences, but in the explanation of that fact. Much also depends on whether the social goal should be equal opportunity or equal incomes. As Professor Claudia Golden, an economist at Harvard, put it, quote, Is equality of income what we really want? Do we want everyone to have an equal chance to work 80 hours in their prime reproductive years? Yes, but we don't expect them to take that chance equally often, end quote. Research by another female economist lends empirical support to that conclusion. Sylvia Ann Hewlett surveyed more than 2,000 women and more than 600 men. Her conclusions? Quote, About 37% of women take an off-ramp at some point in their career, meaning they quit their jobs, but just for an average of 2.2 years. Another substantial number take scenic routes for a while, intentionally not ratcheting up their assignments. For instance, 36% of highly qualified women have sought part-time jobs for some period, while others have declined promotions or deliberately chosen jobs with fewer responsibilities. The data show that highly qualified women aren't afraid of hard work and responsibility. But it's hard to sustain a 73-hour work week if you have serious responsibilities in other parts of your life. End quote. That concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this is kind of a short read. In fact, it's the shortest read we're probably going to do in this entire series, in this entire book. So we'll try to keep to a fairly short analysis and review. And to put this in quick terms, this is basically just the conclusions part of the scientific method. If you were to read this chapter as being conducted in that manner, which I think is the proper and appropriate way to read this chapter. So that'd be kind of like part of the review part of this. And in a good conclusion as part of the scientific method, the first paragraph should basically just Tell the reader what they need to know. Was the hypothesis proved or disproved, or was the entire experiment just junk and all the results should be thrown out? Or were the results completely inconclusive? It should basically say, this is what you should get out of all of this. So in this case, basically what Sowell is telling us is, okay, so what you've just learned is that the gender pay gap is a myth. Or that at least if we look at the raw data, we've done no independent variable control. And if you do the independent variable control, what you'll find is that for all intents and purposes, it's not in any way, in scale at least, due to discrimination or some sort of systemic societal discrimination of some sort. These conclusions that you're drawing in that first paragraph should be basically inferences from the results of testing. So that was the previous read. We talked about how in the previous read, he was basically conducting the testing through the meta-analysis and the data mining and presenting the results of doing that. So he's basically doing testing and results. And in this chapter, he's providing the conclusions. So if the previous parts of the scientific method are done right, then the conclusions, well, the reader should know what to expect from the conclusions. These should be something that you already see coming, because they should be inferred from the previous steps. In this case, it's pretty easy to infer it because of Sowell's pounding with data. He beats you over the head with the raw data and all of this. And that's, I think, what we get out of this chapter in the first paragraph or so. When you move on from there, you generally speaking want to, as part of the conclusion, this is where you would include something like a listing of potential flaws and weaknesses in the methods and in the research and in the testing and the reporting of the results. And Sowell actually does this starting on page 83, continuing on to page 84. While hard data are preferable to anecdotes, even hard data have their limitations. Statistics may not be available on all the factors that determine hiring, pay, or promotions, nor can the direction of causation always be determined when the data are available. So in this case, he's actually pointing out those weaknesses. A good conclusion, in addition to pointing out the weaknesses, will indicate what the impact of those flaws and weaknesses are on the results and the conclusions that the conclusions that have been drawn by the researcher, in this case Sowell, in that first paragraph. And the way you basically do this is to summarize the main points of the results. And by doing so, you can then infer as a reader what that point is. And then as you go throughout that paragraph, you can those paragraphs and throughout those summaries, the summarization of those main points from the results, you can dot in what that impact is. And then at the end, you can basically say what that impact is. And so for all intents and purposes says that, yeah, but the impact really shouldn't be much because we have all of this data to control for certain independent variables. And there's no such thing as metadata on this that's going to be absolutely perfect. And since no one else has even a way to test for these flaws, to control for these flaws and limitations of basically the scientific method in the first place, you have to go based on what information is possible or is possible to become available. At the very end, after you've summarized all these main points, after you've pointed out weaknesses and limitations, after you've gone through the actual conclusions of the results and testing, generally speaking, a good conclusion section reserves throughout the course of the entire scientific method opinion for the very end of the conclusion. So if you've got a research paper and you want to inject your own opinion onto the results of the research. So it has to be something specific to the actual results of the research. Otherwise, it's kind of useless to inject. The place to do it is at the very end of the conclusion section. Sowell actually does that when he points out those two quotes at the end that I'm not going to reread, but you guys can rewind the tape and see those two quotes. A good type of overt opinion to inject would be something along the lines of, so we did all this research, but in hindsight, the only reason we did this was because the Department of the Navy insisted we do it, and in finding out the results that we got, and in further review, we think that with hindsight being on our advantage here, these trials may be unethical, and although the research we have might be useful, I don't think anyone should be bothering to doing these research anymore. We know this. A perfect example of this would be the Stanford experiment, where you may want to report the results of the experimentation and then draw the conclusions from the results of the experimentation. But then at the very end, the author would say something along the lines of, please don't do this. This was clearly unethical from the get-go, and I don't know how else to conduct this sort of research. So this is going to be information that we're either going to have to find a completely new way to do this, or that we're going to have to reserve because it's unethical. So that's pretty much everything to get out of the read today. That it's just a summary and conclusion of what we've already read. And since he does such a good job of hitting the points that I just suggested, we can pretty much infer the conclusions and summaries from the previous reads quite astutely. One thing that might get missed, and he brought up this point before, and I hit on this point before myself, is the point that's introduced on page 83. It's not introduced here, but he brings it up again on page 83. And this is a point about statistics that so often gets missed by so many people, especially those on a certain other side, Bosch. But this is the point that he brings up. What we are left with, after taking into account all the factors that we are aware of and for which statistics are available, are residual differences which measure the upper limit of the combined effect of employer discrimination plus whatever other factors have been overlooked or not specified precisely. So I think we talked about this on this channel. I will link to the video that we in the description of this video. I will link to where I've gone over what that might look like. I think we did that in this channel, so it'll be a link to, I think, a video in this channel. I'll have to do a review. But when you conduct these sort of independent variable controls, when you subject something to a multivariate analysis, if there seems to still be a gap, say, between men's and women's pays, if the hypothesis that it's due to discrimination against women, first things first, the moment you do conduct these independent variable controls and find out that women are actually making more than men, obviously that can't possibly exist. Or it does, but the discrimination going the other way must be significant, must have a greater impact. If there's still a gap, if we still get to a point where we've done some independent variable control and women are making 97 cents for every dollar that men are making, we'll use the proverbial euphemism that is commonly used in the subject. That doesn't mean that 3-cent difference is is discrimination. It means that at most, that's the amount that can be attributed to discrimination, but also that there are independent variables that you can't control for an infinite number of independent variables. It is beyond the human capacity, which means that there may be other independent variables that haven't been controlled for that could explain the entirety of that difference, and that the amount due to discrimination may be zero. So that's a point that so many people miss, and I will link to a better description of why that's the case and how that's represented, how I can represent that visually for everybody. So you guys can go ahead and check that out. So our next read will begin chapter 4 in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. And that is Academic Facts and Fallacies. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.